be understood as some sort of fatal decision that took place at the beginning. Okay? So we're going back, in some sense, to this originary depth, for want of a better term here. And therefore, we're going back hither, being beyond being. We're going back hither, the good, right, in Heidegger. And that, by the way, would square with your observation that there's very little, if any, and he, by the way, makes that point, I think, again, explicitly in the text. He has no problems with it. We're not concerned here, he says today, bumping up against the issues of good and evil. He says good and bad. Remember that? And he says, not a problem, not a problem. Because we're just not dealing on that level, right? Now, he's not dealing on that level because he's Nietzsche, beyond good and evil. You see what the point I'm trying to get at? Because he's critical of Nietzsche. Being beyond good and evil is just a continuation of the metaphysical tradition in the negative. Do you see? He wants to, when he critiques the Platonic metaphysical tradition from Plato through Hegel and gently through Husserl, okay, when he does that, he's including Nietzsche. Right? Nietzsche is also a metaphysician, whether he likes it or not, despite himself. Okay. So what were we going to say? Oh yes, sure. Well, he's a large debt to lots of people, but that doesn't take anything away from his originality in the ordinary sense of the word, right? So I'm just trying to make clear, I'm trying to kind of demonstrate, as it were, verbally, why the justification of using the word hither here. In other words, a little word, but you just can't throw it out without explaining it, right? So what we're saying is the hither makes a lot of sense because the only way in which he can be originally critical of the metaphysical tradition is to go back hither, that tradition. And if the heart of that tradition begins with, in spades, it probably begins with an Anaximander or somebody like that, but if the heart of it begins in spades with the idea of the good, the metaphysical tradition with Plato, then we've got to be hither Plato. We've got to be, where is Plato? What is the center? What is the height? What is the epitome of reality in Plato? The good. You say? So we got to be hither the good. That's all I'm saying. It's as simple as that, right? But it's complex. You see that? Okay. So, but I just want to say that this is not an arbitrary line here.
That's why he's so interested in the peaceful practice, right?
Yeah.
Because he wants to go.
Yeah, he wants to get.
And why he's using it for his own purposes.
He would be accused of doing. He can be accused of doing that, right? I'm not sure he would put it exactly that way. Okay. So in that context, so you can see there, I hope, the reality of the distinctions being made here between where Nietzsche's at and where Heidegger's at when it comes to the question of the good. And the reason for it is that Heidegger is hither the good in a way that Nietzsche is not, because Nietzsche, in being otherwise than good and evil, is despite himself still in the metaphysical tradition. Okay. And I'm saying then the third line down, which now is an application. I think this is for the first time. That's what I like about doing these kinds of things. I mean, teaching. It's great. Right? So for the first time, I have the occasion now to apply the logic of the note to Faith and Philosophy on my website as already applied to the analysis of Agamben's situation, and more generally in the morality seminar to the notion of the thinking now occurring as beyond politics, where politics means beyond X, or where beyond X, politics is substituted for beyond X, because politics is all about walls. It's all about military-industrial complexes. It's all about self and other. You see, it's all about either being beyond those guys or keeping those guys beyond us. It's all about beyond X. It's probably the most practical, everyday experience that we have of what it means to be beyond X. Right? Okay. So the beyond politics, which I think I'm going to translate I'm going to try and put this together as a manuscript and send it off to somebody. I'm going to translate that more broadly, which is justified in the text there in one of the morality papers as beyond sovereignty, and that's explained logically in the first or second of the morality papers. Okay, so All right, so we've already done that. So now let's take occasion here, the occasion Heidegger gives us to notice something. Well, Heidegger can't be what the thinking now occurring is, because that's not his project, right? But the thinking now occurring doesn't have his hang-up. It doesn't have any, it has no investment in owning, in ownership, in self-consciousness, positively or negatively. It's just as happy to leave it altogether in the past, right? Without having to say, as Heidegger doesn't want to say, that the past is false, and he doesn't want to say it leads up to us. Well, the thinking now occurring is 100% in agreement with that. It doesn't lead up to us, right? And it doesn't mean it's false. It's just there and it belongs to the past. So the thinking now occurring is free in a way that Heidegger is not, to be beyond. Now this is frightening. This is what I like about thinking. The thinking now occurring is beyond the good. Well, hold on to your seats. I mean, this sounds, as my friend Kaneen, one of those what now appear to be rare times when he was here, but early on, one of the things he noticed, I forget what we were talking about exactly, but he said that, this was kind of dangerous stuff.
Yes.
You remember that? I can't remember.
Be used for lots of evil.
Whatever, something like that, because I can't
Really?
remember. Yeah, I can't remember what it is. But anyway, that reminds me of that kind of quality of, you could chalk it up to the quality of real freedom, okay? But here we're able to articulate in the logic of the thinking now occurring. So in other words, it's not just a feeling, it's not just an assertion, you see, but now the logic on the occasion provided by Heidegger, the logic bears it out, right? That to be beyond being in the context where beyond being, beyond X, doesn't mean politics, but it means the good. Now that's an interesting thing, isn't it? You see? That's so interesting. In other words, does it mean that it is effectively two sides of the absolutely one-sided coin in the thinking now occurring? Is it effectively, identically, to say beyond politics, beyond the good? Well, and I think of Massachusetts still called the Commonwealth, and we still use the term res publica, and what we mean by that, and literally it means the public, or it could be the common thing, but its substantive meaning in the political tradition is the common weal, the common wealth. But the common weal is not just money, it's the common good. It's the koinon. The Greeks were so great. Everything that everybody, starting with the Romans, every time the Greeks said something, the Romans had to say it in two words. They never had the conciseness of the Greek language. So res publica shows something about the deficiency of Roman language, means the public thing. But the Greeks just said ta koinon, the common thing.
Well, the commons is the equivalent.
Well, we have some of that. Yeah. So to be beyond, and then now I'm thinking back to Plato's idea of the good. It was the idea beyond being and beyond truth. It was like the sun, and on the physical analogy to the sun, the one problem with it was everything in a certain sense for its being, for its life, and for its growth, depending on light, truth, and so forth. All of that radiated from the good. But one problem with the good, the sun, physical analogy, was if you look straight at it, you go blind. You can't, right?
You can't see it.
You can't see it, as it were, directly, right? You can only see it indirectly in some sense. Okay. This is what they're thinking. Why would it possibly want to be beyond the good? Not that it wants to be, it is, right? Why would it be beyond the good? What would it signify to be beyond the good? To be beyond politics? It would be to be at, if I put this in Platonic terms, just as a little risky, right? To be at the really real, or in terms that probably get Heidegger all agitated, to be at, as it were, I don't mean this literally, the most real, right, in the Heideggerian and traditional sense of the word, to be there directly, not indirectly, so that it doesn't burn your eyes. You see? Now, what kind of eyes would you need to look directly at the sun? Well, you'd need a very different set of eyes. I suggest you would need, I'm playing a little bit here, but it's a serious play. would need the eyes of a resurrected body. Right? So the thinking now occurring is the beginning of the resurrection in a profound sense, you see, that we are now able to see the sun directly. We're now able to see the good. So in that sense, we're beyond the good. Right? In the sense in which the good was beyond being. Right? We're beyond because the good that we are beyond in this context is the good that could only be seen indirectly. Or so what does it mean to say beyond the good? To be beyond the good is to see the good directly. What does that really mean? Well, one way of looking at it is we have a new set of eyes. That when we look, we can look directly at the sun and we don't go blind. That's one way of looking at it. That's, I want to say, that's the receptive part of productive receptivity. But the other way of understanding being beyond the good, that is seeing it directly so that it doesn't burn our eyes and we go blind. Seeing it directly means here producing it. To see is to make. Right? To think, to understand is to create. That's the bottom line. And those two ways of looking at it, productive and receptively, right, is having a new, as it were, apparatus that not hitherto exist. Remember, the seeing, Plato was using the seeing as the physical metaphor for the mind, right? So having a new mind, right? But an essentially new mind is a mind which is able to understand directly the good, but then it's beyond the good as an indirect object, right? To understand directly the good is, in a certain sense, not so much to see it in the traditional sense, but it is immediately and at once to produce it, to make it. It is to make. It's the finality of creating the world. It's really unqualifiedly creating the world of our experience in a way which is ideally presented in Kant, but then in Kant only presented as within the limits of the noumenal world, right? There is the really real world, which was at least, if not more invisible than the noumenal good of Plato. Okay? You just do that? Okay. All right. So then I say on the handout, beyond. So the thinking now occurring is beyond being, in this context, beyond the good, otherwise than the good, not the good, and not the good. But I think the boldest. And so if you take the last one, which is not the boldest, it's the more complicated expression of it, but it has the value. If you say beyond the good, that's good. I like that because that's stark, okay, and challenging. But if you want to parse it out a little bit, which I've already done, so I'm not going to repeat myself, then when you look at not the good and not the good, that's, as it were, the opening for understanding what I'm talking about here when I say that we are creating, right, the real. Right? Okay. And then he says concerning this beyond the good, beyond being as the good, down in number 10 at the bottom of 147. Not only did Christianity and its interpretation of world find here its framework and primary indication of constitution, but also all post-Christian, anti-Christian, and non-Christian Western interpretation of beings and of man found their framework and constitution within the same. The ekkaina tes usias as agathon, the beyond being as good, that means the fundamental denial of any further and originary questioning of beings as such. Questioning of being is the primeval image of all interpretation of beings and their determination and shaping in the context of a culture. His assessment of cultural values, his interpretation of the actual with respect to its meaning, is the imaging of an idea according to ideas and measuring ideals, in viewing beings in the whole, viewing world, i.e. worldview. Wherever worldview dominates and determines beings, Platonism is at work. Right? So the thinking now occurring understands itself to be beyond that critique in being beyond the good, and therefore beyond the questioning of being, and instead, as it were, of the questioning of being, which is in some sense the be-all and end-all of Heidegger's thinking. Instead of the questioning of being, by which he means, you see, this kind of openness, projecting open, not foreclosing, not anticipating, not objectifying. Instead of that, in the thinking now occurring, we have the production of the world, the creation of the world, right? Which has something analogous to the openness of Heidegger's questioning of being, but now as productive receptivity of being. It is at once open to being, but I want to say that openness is immediately filled with being, but not filled with being out of a projection of being, but out of a projection of the opening, which is immediately particularized, to use the language we used elsewhere. All right. If we move maybe we should stop off on 153 and 156. On 153, this goes into the area, which is continued in today's assignment, of the leap. And on 153, he speaks of, in number 24, bringing about a preparedness for leaping into Dasein. An unavoidable task is to initiate the overcoming of Platonism by means of a more originary knowing awareness of what is its ownmost. The leaping into Dasein, I think I pointed out to you before, every once in a while you'll catch him saying that Dasein is the between. So leaping into Dasein, leaping into the between, I want to say discovering a more originary knowing awareness of what is Dasein's ownmost. These are all different aspects of the same thing, right? So that leaping is a leaping into one's originary ownmost, in some sense, is the thrust of that leaping, if I put it that way. And on page 156, he makes an interesting comment at the top of page 156 that Dasein is the simultaneity of time-space with what is true as a being. Dasein sways as the grounding ground, as the between, and the midpoint is the interesting phrase, in beings themselves. All right? So there is a Dasein is the between. That is the midpoint, or putting it another way, the midpoint. It is the between, which is in beings themselves. Right? So beings here are not, again, I guess the best way of understanding how that should be understood, at least in the negative, provisionally, is that obviously beings here are not objects. Again, once we're beyond the subject-object relationship between Dasein and being in its comprehensive finitude, you see, and insofar as beings in the Heideggerian, in the context of Heideggerian being, right, insofar as those beings have their truth not in infinite being as they do and would in Hegel, but have their truth in the finitude of being, insofar as they have their truth in the finitude of being, right? And insofar as Dasein is that which being uses in the disclosure of its own most truth, or of the own most truth of being, and it's more complicated. And insofar as beings, contrary to the Hegelian notion, have a nothingness, contrary to the Hegelian notion, in which Hegelian notion they have a nothingness of their own, and insofar as beings in Heidegger, contrary to the Hegelian notion in which beings have a nothingness of their own, don't have a nothingness of their own, but have a nothingness that belongs to finite being which is unique and needy, you see, a being which, as he says somewhere in today's, is on a par with the nothing, you see, a being which elsewhere he has said to which belongs the not and the nothing, all right? So insofar as beings, see, in other words, he's not disagreeing with Hegel that the truth of beings in some sense is beyond the beings. Okay? But instead of the truth of beings being in infinite being, the truth of beings is in finite being in Heidegger. And since the truth of beings, I wish now little Adam was here, because I'm going to say something that relates to a question he asked a long time ago. Insofar as the beings in Heidegger have their truth in the finitude of being, right, then the nothingness of those beings, despite appearances in the Hegelian universe, doesn't originally belong to those beings, but they have it by virtue of the fact that somehow or other they instate him, right? They stand in. Is it instate him? They stand in being, and he says that explicitly in today's text, and I think I quoted on this handout, right? So those beings in the context of finite being, they have a nothingness, and in a certain sense, their nothingness is the truth of their being as beings. But that truth, that nothingness that they have, belongs to being, whose finitude is not a function of dialectical determination, or a function of, in the negative, of indetermination, but which is original to being, those beings stand in being. They inabide, in the language of the translation, right? And that's what I meant by the transitive notion there, right? That they are not just abiding, but they are I don't want to say, yeah, they're almost, yeah, they're standing in, and in a certain sense they're withstanding, right, what in a metaphysical context would be the downdraft into non-being. They don't not exist. They exist in the context qua finite. If I put it in Cartesian terms, qua finite, they are, right? Or in their insofar as they somehow or other Descartes, remember at the end of I think it's at the end of the Meditations. If it isn't at the end of the Meditations, it's probably at the end of the third meditation. But anyway, in the Faith and Philosophy, you could check that out. Descartes says of himself that he exists midway between the divine being and nothing. All right. Now, that's not exactly the way Heidegger is thinking, but it gives you the idea that so Descartes winds up saying that no matter what, his fundamental certitude, long before he knows whether he's a human being or what kind of being he is, he could be a kangaroo for all he knows, right? He's a thinking being. That he knows. He's a thinking thing, but he doesn't at that point of that certitude, he doesn't identify with human being, right? He's just a finite thinker. That's all he knows. And at that point, he's not sure whether he has a body. And if you don't have a body, it's hard to tell what kind of an animal you are. Okay. All right. So at that point, he contents himself with saying that he is not nothing. He puts it that way. Puts it in the negative, and he also puts it positively as something. Aliquid, he says in the Latin. Well, aliquid, is very indefinite. It's something. But anyway, whatever it is, it doesn't make any difference. It ain't nothing. That's the key point. Which reminds me, by the way, that in the 5 proofs for the existence of God, which Heidegger keeps indirectly alluding to, God is cause and so forth and so on, in Thomas, I went back to check that text because if you read Heidegger, you think that Thomas is coming up with God as the highest being, the supreme being, and so forth and so on, which, as I think I alluded to, would be justified if we were doing Anselm. But of course, Anselm was one of the guys that Thomas is very critical of, ontologically, intellectually, metaphysically, right? Thomas is very careful every time he proves that God must exist as the first mover, or out of an argument from necessity, or you name it, one of the 5 arguments. His conclusion is there must be, and then he'll use, depending on the context of the Latin, there must be something that does this. And this something, this aliquid or this aliquod or whatever, is what we call God, says Thomas. So he never says that. See, it's so subtle. Really, he got away with the reputation of being an Aristotelian, right? But Aristotle would not have hedged at that point. For Aristotle, the unmoved mover, the prime unmoved mover, was a being. He was. Yes, what Heidegger is saying would be true of Aristotle. He was the highest being, right? Supreme being. Aristotle's unmoved mover was definitely that. Thomas looks like he's doing an Aristotelian-like argument again. Unmoved mover, he just adds a few more of the same ilk, right? But when he comes to the conclusion, he doesn't say, well, then, there is a being that does this, and we call that being. Okay? No, there is something that does this, and we call that something. See, that leaves open the possibility that this something is ipsum esse. You see what I'm saying? In other words, that this being, this essence, which is indistinguishable from its existence, is not a being, and because he never. And that's where Descartes learned a lot, and he applied it in a mischievous way. He learned a lot from Thomas, right? The indefiniteness is not so bad, right? Now, how did I get onto that? Okay, so we're back here with Heidegger, and These beings in abide. They stand in. They, as it were, continue in being. They are not. How did I put it on the thing? I think I put it. Yeah, stands in being. That's a direct quote from him someplace, not on this page. I don't think. Elsewhere later in our assignment. Whereas in Hegel, such a being would be swallowed up in being, right? Because the truth of finite being, its own truth is its nothingness, and as it were, and its ultimate truth is in infinite being, and infinite being swallows it up. It has no standing, literally, right? It doesn't abide, let alone inabide, in Hegel in infinite being. Whereas in the finite being, the truth of beings is consonant with the truth of being. Now I know why Dasein is right. The between that Dasein is right there in the beings. Because the truth of the beings is the truth of being. And Dasein is what being uses, you see, to disclose, to create the disclosure for the truth of being. Right? So none of the, I'm almost tempted to say something that I say about American pragmatism in a certain sense, although it has a different meaning and connotation here. But what goes out in Heidegger in a non-pragmatic way, but in a way that's analogous to what happens in pragmatism, are any of these kind of sharp, objectifying, dividing lines. You see, there's a kind of pervasiveness of the finitude of being, such that there's nothing to keep the between that Dasein is from being the between in the beings who have their abidingness, right, in being, being with the hyphen. All right. Then if we move into today's assignment and maybe around 63, 163 and following, 162 is where he starts with the leap here. Well, actually it starts on the previous page, but we can take a look at it on page 162 and following. And again, perhaps zeroing in a little bit on something that has already come up here. Maybe we should start at the bottom of 162. Last paragraph. But in the other beginning, beings are such that they also carry the clearing into which they are placed. So that's along the lines of what we were just noting in the previous pages, right? So it's not simply that they are in a clearing, right? But insofar as Dasein is the between, which is in them, in beings, they also carry the clearing into which they are placed, which clearing holds sway as clearing for self-sheltering and concealing, i.e. for being as enoning. And the other beginning, of course, now is the beginning toward which we're going when we leap into the between, right? That's as it were, the direction in which we're going. We're leaping off from the first beginning into the between, which in some sense is unintelligible without the other beginning. In the other beginning, all beings are, this is the point I was making earlier, are sacrificed to being, for which beings as such first receive their truth. Now, there he said what I was saying a little less directly a few moments ago on the other pages, right? All right, so the truth of, so yes, in Hegel, right, beings get their truth from infinite being. In Heidegger, beings get their truth from being. They get their truth from finite being. but being holds sway as an owning, as the site for the moment of decision about the nearness and remoteness of the last God. Here in the unavoidable ordinariness of being is the most non-ordinary, and this estranging of being is not a manner of its appearing, but rather is being itself. So he often couples the needfulness, I think, and the strangeness of being. In the domain of grounding its truth, that is, in Dasein, the uniqueness of death corresponds to the non-ordinariness of being. Right? So now he himself is now making the analogy which I've been working with here for several weeks. Right? In other words, what I call the being-scape is, as it were, the structure of Dasein writ large, or the structure of Dasein, as it were, accounted for. Right? Or the structure of Dasein in its original and originary shape, as it were. So corresponding to the uniqueness of death in being in time and in general in Dasein is the non-ordinary, the uniqueness of being, right? The most terrifying rejoicing has to be the dying of a god. Only man has the distinction of standing before death, because man inabides in being. So beings inabide in being, man inabides in being. Death is the utmost testimonial for being. So now we got a really, you want to put it crudely, a very positive spin on death. All right, because again, death is being taught. Death is that part of what? Anticipatory, that's the anticipatory part of anticipatory resoluteness, which in the moment, right, is the concrete freedom for Dasein, and here you can apply it post-ontologically to being, is the moment for Dasein to authentically become itself. That is, to become you want to say the one thing necessary for it. Right? Now the unique thing, huh? I like the word particular, you understand, but I'm afraid to use it because I think one could use it, but then one would have to do with the caution that I'm not sure that one could find Heidegger consistently using it in the way in which it might be used here. That would be the danger that I would see. Okay, but anyway, what I call crudely put, the positive spin on death. The analog and the thinking now occurring, I think I said once in class here, I found myself saying to Tegan, my granddaughter, on the way home from the ethics seminar, she asked me a lot of questions, and one of them had to do with death. And I said to her in the car, off the top of my head, because she was giving me these tough questions, well, I think death kind of confirms what I was saying before, namely that we are really creating the world. That in other words, the finality of what we do, right, in that being beyond the good, right? So being beyond the good, seeing the good directly in the sense of producing the good, as it were, directly, right? Not being blinded by it, but by having precisely, as it were, the mental. I don't I'm speaking crudely now, but the mental apparatus to do that, right? Death is the confirmation of the reality of the creation that we do, right? Otherwise, we'd be involved in some sort of unending spiral, reincarnation or God knows what. As far as that goes, the thinking now occurring shares something of Heidegger's attitude here. Skipping a paragraph. Only in Dasein is that truth founded for being in which all beings are only for the sake of being. Oh, I was alluding to that before, so I got a few things here on one half a page that are quite relevant, right? So all beings are only for the sake of being. We have previously been told everything is for the sake of Dasein, right? But I think I've kind of explained that insofar as it were, when I say the needfulness that being has for Dasein, I've now come up with a word that comes to my head that I think might work here. That Dasein is, and this is not meant in any casual or insignificant sense, is the stand-in for being. You see? It's the instanding of being. Right? Dasein has to inabide. Being's inabide, right? But the inabiding of Dasein is the standing in for being. And in that, right, it's being stand. I need a stand. I can't go on tonight. I'm sick. Will you go on for me? You'll be my stand-in. What do they call it in the theater? It's not a stand. What do they call it?
Understudy.
Well, the understudy. Okay, but it's a stand-in. Somebody stands in. You stand in for somebody, right, who can't be there themselves, so to speak, right? So Dasein is the stand-in, the inabiding, right, of being, right? And as such, and only as such, is it true that Dasein is that for the sake of which things are. You see? Dasein is that for the sake of which things are, insofar as Dasein is standing in for being, of whom it is true that being is that for which ultimately everything is. Being that lights up as the trace of the way of the last God. By way of grounding Dasein, man is transformed. All right, and in the 118, the leap is projecting open the essential sway of being to the utmost, such that we place ourselves into what is thus opened up. Here's another version of the thrower throne idea, right? I think he might use it a little bit later here, I'm not sure. We place ourselves into what is thus opened up, becoming inabiding, inständig, instanding, and through ennonement, first become ourselves. And then he's dropping down about 4 or 5 lines. Why and in what sense a being is a being for us? There is always beforehand a projecting open, and the question is only whether or not, as thrower, the one who projects open itself, leaps into an opening trajectory of the throw. So the thrower leaps into the trajectory of its own throw. Whether projected. So there's a kind of, in a number of senses, you can see how that's authenticity. That's, I want to say, if you were dealing on a more ordinary level, we're talking about integrity, right? What is it? Put your money where your mouth is, that kind of thing, right? This is a kind of deeper understanding of that, right? If you're really throwing something, if you're really projecting open something, then you ought to be there. You ought to be fully involved in that projection, in that openness, right? You ought to, in some sense, be, as it were, indistinguishable from that openness, just as the beings carry with them. They're not simply in the open, but they carry that openness with them. Okay? And how can the beings participate in the openness that Dasein projects? Well, because he's already told us that Dasein is, as the between is in, as the midpoint is in those beings, which we've kind of explained, and I'm not going to repeat that again. Okay. All right. So at the bottom of the page, he says, what counts in the other beginning is the leap into the encleaving midpoint of the turning of an owning, in order thus to prepare in knowing, inquiring, and setting the style, the da, regarding its grounding. We can never understand a being through explanation and deduction from other beings. A being can only be known in terms of its grounding in the truth of being. But how seldom man shifts into this truth, how easily and quickly he is content with a being, and thus content, well, really the real emphasis is on the word content. how quickly he is content with a being and thus continues to be dis and owned of being, how compelling the dispensability with the truth of being seems to be. On the theme of the thrower throne on page 169, he says, again, continuing this discussion of the leap, which is central, the throne projecting open, number 122. The leap is the enactment of projecting open the truth of being in the sense of shifting into the open, such that the thrower of the projecting open experiences itself as thrown, i.e. as owned by being. Right? So the becoming oneself for the first time, becoming ourselves for the first time, is being owned by being. I guess you could supply here implicitly owned by being, not owned by ourselves. Right? In that sense, a sacrifice. And I think a good. I don't know whether he uses the word. He may yet. I can't remember. But a good sense of a surrender here, right? A surrender of oneself to being, right? In the leap, right? There's a certain. I almost want to say there's a certain abandonment of self corresponding to an answer to the abandonment of being. Yeah. And the abandonment of being is perhaps exactly what it's calling for, right? It's calling for being is abandoned by being, so as to call forth from man, or call forth from Dasein, or man grounding Dasein, to call forth an abandonment of self in the sense hitherto understood, or maybe an abandonment of self in every sense. In being owned by being. So an abandonment of self in every sense, perhaps, but not an abandonment of selfhood. Something like that. And then, so what comes into my mind here, as opposed to simply being swallowed up by infinite being in Hegel, right? The abandonment of self, which otherwise in a Hegelian metaphysical universe would involve being swallowed up by infinite being, this abandonment of self has the strange property, the surprising, the unexpected, which by the way fits with the notion of a leap, right? This is a thoroughgoing leap. When you leap, you don't know exactly what to expect. You've lost your footing, right? Okay. Well, now the leap here, I want to say, penetrates through and through the leaper. The throw penetrates through and through the thrower, right? And so what I'm trying to get to is that whereas you would expect to be swallowed up by the infinite absolute self-consciousness, here in abandoning self in response to the abandonment of being, in recognizing the refusal and withdrawal of being as a gifting, you see, and the only way you can recognize that is not, as he says somewhere in here, not verbally, not by saying it, not by, right? It's by doing it. All right? The only way you can do that is to surrender yourself altogether, and then the surprise of the leap is that you're in abiding. You're standing in. This is an indebtedness, I think, as I'm saying this formally to Kierkegaard, right? You're standing, all right, in the between. Not only in the between, but in and as the between. But you. I don't want to say you're surviving. You see, that's the wrong word. But you're continuing. I think he uses that word when he talks about. He used the word continuing. So, nevertheless, you're continuing, as it were, to be, but now you're continuing to be in the opening of the truth of being, whereas otherwise, see, so Hegel turns out to be the boogeyman, trying to scare us. You do that, and you're going to get swallowed up by by the infinite. You're going to cease to be altogether. And Heidegger's reassuring, no. Nothing to fear. Okay, something like that.
There must be something to fear because it's talking only a few
Well,
will, in fact, do the leap.
that's right. Yeah.
So the rest will fear to do the leap.
Yes. But they ought not to.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean, those who make the leap obviously are not afraid to do it, or they have set aside or overcome or left their fear behind. Right? And then the enquivering idea on the same page, 169, in 123, let us venture the unmediated word. Being is the enquivering of God's godding, of echoing ahead the God's decision about their God. This enquivering widens the free play of time-space in which it itself comes into the open as refusal. Thus being is the ennowing of ennonement of the there, that open within which it itself quivers. So I explain this analogically as the finite equivalent of the dialectical movement. Right? This is a movement, an enquivering, which in a certain sense isn't going anywhere, in a certain sense isn't going away, but is that which opens the Heideggerian space for the ennonement of the there. Being must be thought all the way out to this extreme matter, but in this way it lights up as the most finite and the richest, as most of all holding to outground its own most intimacy to itself. For being is never a determination of God itself. Rather, being is that which the godding of gods needs in order nonetheless to remain totally differentiated from being. Being, as in the beingness of metaphysics, is neither the highest and purest determination of theon, divine, and deus, and the absolute, nor is being. What belongs to this interpretation, the commonest and emptiness cover for everything that is not. But as refusal of being is not sheer retreat and withdrawal, but the opposite. Refusal is the intimacy of an allotting. In the enquivering, the clearing of the da in its abground dimension gets allotted. The da is allotted as what is to be grounded, as Dasein. And I think I've already noted the interesting, what obviously must be more than a coincidence between the role of allotment and the distribution of existence in the morality seminar and his use of allotment here. That's fundamental to what's going on in the clearing. I want to make a point of getting to 172, number 127 and 172. And in fact, you can begin right above that because it's another thing that I called attention to. 2 paragraphs above 127 on page 172. He says, being is not and can never be more being than a being, but also not less being than gods, because gods are not at all. Being is the between in the midst of beings and gods, completely and in every respect incomparable, needed by the gods and withdrawn from a being. Therefore, being is reachable only by the leap into the abandonment of being as godding. And then, interesting enough, in parentheses, refusal. All right? So one could say the godding of the gods takes the form of refusal. takes the form of the abandonment by being, and happily gods don't have any being, so the abandonment of being, or the abandonment of being by being, or the abandonment by being of being, not only doesn't preclude the goddings, but is the gods, but it is the very form of the possibility of the, or the possibility or the actuality of the coming of the god. That is, the very form is the refusal, which is understood to be, maybe by, as you point out, by few, if not all, as a gifting, right? As in pedestrian terms, as an opportunity, or as the opportunity. And the opportunity to do what, by the way? To make the decision, right? Which decision, I mean, the leap is, in a certain sense, the leap is the, in one sense, the form of the decision, which decision leaves behind the decision-making of the first beginning. Right? Now, in the section on cleavage, 127, the cleavage is the unfolding unto itself of the intimacy of being itself, insofar as we experience it as refusal and turning in refusal. Nevertheless, if one wanted to attempt the impossible and to grasp the essential sway of being with the help of metaphysical modalities, then one could say refusal is the highest actuality of the highest possible, as possible, and thus is the first necessity, discounting, of course, the origin of modalities in ousia. He's already said, that one time we didn't focus on it, but when he listed Hegel and Schelling and I think Kant there earlier on, he acknowledged, he has a book, by the way, Heidegger does, on Schelling's treatise on human freedom, in which he does a kind of exegesis of Schelling. But here he says he has an appreciation of human freedom as articulated in Schelling, but on a different foundation. That is to say, beyond the metaphysical modalities is what he's really talking about, would be relevant here, right? So yes, we can talk about freedom, yes, we can talk about necessity, but we're now no longer talking about them in terms of the modalities in ousia, or the metaphysical notion of the modalities. Instead, dropping down a few lines, instead we must try to think the cleavage according to that basic sway of being, by virtue of which it is the region of decision for the contention of the gods. This contention hinges on their arrival in flight, a contention in which gods first God and put their God to decision. Well, if they put their God to decision, when is Dasein put to decision? When it's abandoned by being. When the familiar and the ordinary collapse. Right? In being in time terms, when it experiences angst, it is called to, it's now open, it's now ready to respond to the call of conscience. Right? So analogously, if the gods put their God to decision, then they're going to do that by godding, right? And godding is told us in a couple of places indirectly is a kind of refusal, right? So the gods are going to put their God to the decision in some sense, you see, by doing analogously in their relationship with their God that they're putting to the decision, an analogous kind of withdrawal, right? An analogous opportunity or call for resoluteness or decision in this unique sense, right? The decision as the decision, as a unique decision. So in the top of 173, being is the enquivering of God's godding, enquivering as the widening of the free play of time-space, in which enquivering itself as refusal, you see, and owns its clearing, the Da. The intimacy of this enquivering needs a cleavage that is held utmost to Abground, and it is this cleavage that the inexhaustibility of being, it is in this cleavage that the inexhaustibility of being can be intimated and thought. The inexhaustibility of the finitude of being. Right? I'm almost tempted to say that the end of being this explains the analogy that I made one day to Einstein's view of the universe as a finite whole about which you can travel infinitely. By analogy, there's something about this finitude of being, you see, where the end of being is inexhaustible. That is, the end, there's no end. That's the way I put it. There's no end to the end of being. There's no end to the ending of being, because it is, you could say, always the moment. All right? It is always, it always arrives in the form of the moment and the decision that is uniquely made in that moment, and there can, right? It doesn't have an objective presence-like being from which we can move on. It's not somehow or there's some kind of hollowed out now in a unending sequence of nows, right? Okay. And then he's going to say on 176, well, let's just drop down a little further on 173, in the second paragraph of 128. Or does man's intimation of being come precisely not from a being, but rather from that alone which has equal rank with being, because it continues to belong to being, from the nothing? And the nothing is then further defined as, at the end of that little paragraph, as the overflow of pure refusal. The richer the nothing, the simpler the being. But what counts above all is grounding the truth of being. Only then do we take the annihilating from the insidious word nothing and give it the power of pointing to the abground dimension of being. And then further on the nothing, in 129, toward the bottom of the page, seen from the perspective of beings, being is not a being. It is the non-being, the not being, and thus following the ordinary concept of nothing. No reservation can be entertained regarding this explanation, especially since a being is taken as what is objective and extant, and the nothing is taken as the total negating of a being so intended. But in the next paragraph, considering the most general and emptiest concept of being as an object, this negative determination of nothing is, however, the most annihilating, to which everyone is at once and readily ill-disposed. If our inquiry were concerned merely with this pertinent but nevertheless not yet grasped nothingness, then this inquiry should not claim to put metaphysics into question and to determine more originarily how being and the nothing belong together. But how would it be if being itself were the self-withdrawing and would hold sway as refusal? Is this something insignificant or the highest gifting? And is it even above all by virtue of this not character of being itself that the nothing, now here's the point we've made a few times, but it's nicely nailed down by Heidegger in the text. By virtue of this not character of being itself, that the nothing is full of that allotting power whose steadfastness gives rise to all creating, of being becoming more being. Right? So the nothing is full of the allotting power whose steadfastness gives rise to all creating. Analogous to what is being said about the distributor of the dwelling in the context of the thinking now occurring, where it is said fundamentally and universally, certainly in recent years and probably in that text and in the preparation of that text that I'm making to send out, there is nothing but existence. Now, what isn't in Heidegger and what is in the thinking now occurring, because the thinking now occurring need not be hither the good, since it is not only need not be hither the good, but because it need not be hither the good, it is in fact beyond the good. All right. What is in the thinking now occurring when it comes to the allotment, the power of allotment in the nothing, which is the withdrawal of being. See, there's another place in my notes here in the text, which I'm probably not going to get to explicitly at the moment, so I'll just jump ahead to it mentally. But it applies here. That's what making me think of it. Remember that whole thing about omnipotence in Kierkegaard? We said that Kierkegaard talks about the withdrawal of omnipotence constituting the continuity and independence of the creature, and it would be a poor omnipotence. He says in effect, I'm not quoting him verbatim, but in effect what he says, it would be a very poor omnipotence that couldn't make the creature independent of it, right? But there is a poverty in Kierkegaard's anti-Hegelian understanding of it, and the poverty is that there's this continual, unending withdrawal of omnipotence from the creature. And we say in the thinking now occurring, I think even in the ethics seminar, vis-a-vis Badiou, there's a clean break in the thinking now occurring, right? There's not a continual withdrawing. Well, analogously, that critique applies here to what he's saying about the nothing, right? There is a nothing that is formed by the withdrawal of being, of finite being. The withdrawal of finite being creates the nothing which is full of the power of allotting. You see? But notice, there's no complete abandonment of. There's an abandonment of being. See, but it ain't a clean break. It ain't a complete abandonment, right? In fact, the very terminology abandonment suggests a certain resentment on the part of what's being abandoned, right? You understand what I'm saying? In other words, yes, it's a gifting, but the gifting is, it's a refusal. It's, I want to say it's tough love. You see? Now, who do you treat properly with tough love? Well, those of your children. We're speaking parent-child, make it easy, right? I mean, you may have friends who need to do this too, but in a parent-child context, which I think is most relevant here, by the way, especially when it comes to God the Father, and so forth. Tough love toward the child is only going to be required. Tough love is going to be required when the child is misbehaving. And I think especially when the child is addicted to something, right? So tough love may be, you keep taking drugs, out you go. Right? May not be the right answer. I don't know. I'm just saying, use an example. You understand the principle of that, right? Okay. But now, is tough love the only form of love or the best form of love? In other words, isn't the best situation where the love of the parent for the child doesn't have to take the form of tough love? Where, in other words, the child is not fundamentally screwed up, not addicted or not codependent or whatever. I mean, I think tough love is the real answer to codependency. I think that's right. I don't know. You guys would know better than I. But it's something like that.
Sounds good to me.
Huh?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. So what I'm saying is that the thinking now occurring, the clean break of omnipotence vis-a-vis the creation, is not a form of abandonment. You see, it's not perceived as abandonment. It's not perceived as refusal. Right? It's perceived in a strictly positive sense as the setting free, which, if I speak in the family terms, which by the way have been applied to the Trinity, is what a father's function is. Right? The healthy, constructive function of a father is to set the child free out on its own, not in the sense of locking the door because it's coming home drunk, but equipping it to exist in a perfect independence of the father. That's the goal of the father, at least. I don't know whether it's the mother's goal. I'm not clear on that.
I work with the mother.
Okay, well maybe a good mother. But anyway, the parent. Okay, let's genderize it. The parent's goal. That would be very good, especially when we're talking about omnipotence, because it's hard to know what the gender there would be. So the goal of the parent is to set the child into a position of independence, and to do so once and for all, not gradually, because the parent has to die. There's a good example of being toward death. Let's get it over with. I'm not going to set you free over the course of the next 40 years, by which time you'll be 60 and I'll be 90. That's not going to work out very well, you see? Okay. So I'm using this little analogy because I think it's deep. There's a deep truth in it.
They have that in England right now.
Which one?
With the Queen getting old and the son being in the wing and not getting
Right.
free.
She's continuing the drawing. Right. Okay. Well, on that note, whatever it's worth, we'll pause because the clock isn't.
No, that wasn't very entertaining at all.
Okay, and we'll have to play a little more catch up, of course, but we will next time.